Why your ancient brain feels safer under trees than under ceilings. There is a particular kind of relief that happens when you step outside. Not the relief of fresh air, not the relief of exercise, not even the relief of leaving a difficult situation behind. Something older than all of that. Something that happens before you have time to think about it. Your shoulders drop, your jaw unclenches, your eyes, instead of fixing on a single point, soften and spread wide across an open sky. And for a moment, just a moment, something that has been quietly tightening inside you for hours finally lets go. You probably assumed this was about stress, about needing a break, about the simple human need to get away from screens and obligations. And those things are true, but they are not the whole story. Because what actually just happened in your nervous system has nothing to do with modern psychology, and everything to do with a deal your brain made with the natural world, hundreds of thousands of years before anyone invented the concept of a vacation. Your brain was not built for rooms. It was built for landscapes. And that single fact, quietly, persistently, relentlessly, shapes your emotional life in ways that most people never consciously trace back to their source. The human nervous system spent the overwhelming majority of its existence operating inside open, semi-structured, natural environments. Savannas, woodland edges, river corridors, coastal margins. Not sealed enclosures with artificial lighting. Not corridors made of identical materials repeating in every direction. Not ceilings 4 meters above heads that evolved to scan horizons 20 kilometers wide. The architecture of modern life is almost incomprehensibly recent in biological terms. And while the human brain is extraordinary at adaptation, there is a crucial difference between what the brain can learn to tolerate and what the brain was actually designed to reward. What neuroscience has begun mapping in the last 2 decades is the precise biological mechanism behind something people have described anecdotally for centuries. The outdoors does not merely feel nice. It actively changes the operating state of your nervous system in ways that indoor environments, no matter how comfortable, cannot fully replicate. Understanding why requires understanding something fundamental about how your brain processes the visual world, and why trees, specifically, are not just pleasant to look at, but are registered by your nervous system as something closer to safety signals. The human visual system did not evolve to process the geometry of constructed space. It evolved to process nature. And nature, at its most foundational level, is not random. It is fractal. A tree does not repeat in a simple mechanical pattern, but its branching structure follows a mathematical self-similarity that appears at every scale, from the width of the trunk to the smallest visible twig. Clouds, coastlines, river deltas, mountain ridges, the surface of a leaf. These structures share a property called fractal dimension, and human visual cortices respond to them in a way that is measurably different from how they respond to the straight lines and right angles of built environments. Researchers studying what is now called fractal fluency have found that the human eye moves through natural fractal patterns with less cognitive effort than it moves through human-made geometries. The brain's visual processing areas, when exposed to mid-range fractal complexity, not too simple, not too chaotic, enter a state of what some researchers describe as relaxed alertness. Alpha wave activity increases in the frontal cortex. Skin conductance, a physiological marker of stress arousal, decreases. And this response happens fast, within minutes of exposure, and in some cases within seconds. What this means is that when you look at a tree, your brain is not simply receiving visual information and cataloging it as pleasant. It is recognizing a structural pattern that it co-evolved with, a pattern that, for most of human history, carried specific information about the environment. Trees meant shade, which meant temperature regulation. Trees meant food, fruit, insects, roots near water sources. Trees meant cover from aerial predators and clear sightlines to ground-level threats. And trees, crucially, meant that you were in a place where other life could exist, which meant you were probably not in a barren or hostile zone where survival would be maximally difficult. Your brain does not consciously process all of this when you look at a tree, but your nervous system does, and it responds accordingly by relaxing the low-grade threat vigilance that modern architecture quietly sustains. If you have ever wondered why you feel more at ease in a park than in a parking garage, or why a room with a view of trees feels qualitatively different from a room with a view of another building, you now have part of the answer. One view is telling your nervous system that it is in a place where life flourishes. The other is telling it nothing, or something far more ambiguous. This is a good moment to pause and say, if this kind of thinking resonates with you, the kind that connects neuroscience to everyday experience in ways that actually change how you see your own life, subscribe to The Darwin Way and hit like. We are building something here that takes the science seriously without losing the human thread. Now, let us go deeper. Because the tree story is only one layer, there is another mechanism operating simultaneously, and it runs even older than the visual system. It lives in your autonomic nervous system, specifically in the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic activation, and in how the natural environment modulates that balance in ways that human-constructed environments almost never do. The autonomic nervous system is, in a functional sense, the part of your brain that is constantly assessing whether you are safe or whether you should be ready to fight, flee, or freeze. It does this automatically, without conscious input. It reads your environment through sensory channels you are mostly unaware of, not just what you see, but what you hear, what you smell, what temperature and humidity your skin detects, and even the quality of the light reaching your eyes. And it updates its threat assessment continuously, adjusting your physiological state hundreds of times a day in ways you usually only notice when they become extreme enough to break into conscious awareness. Here is what most people do not realize. The modern indoor environment is not neutral. It is not a baseline that your nervous system treats as a 0 point. For a brain shaped by millions of years of evolution in the natural world, an indoor environment is a novel stimulus, and novelty by default requires monitoring. Your nervous system does not know that your office is safe. It has no evolutionary template for fluorescent lighting, for the hum of HVAC systems, for air that does not move in organic patterns, for spaces with no visible exit to open ground. It has to figure out whether these conditions are threatening, and while it generally concludes that they are not, because nothing attacks you, because nothing changes abruptly, that conclusion requires ongoing effort, a low, continuous expenditure of vigilance. This is not anxiety. It does not feel like danger. It feels like nothing, which is precisely the problem. It is below the threshold of conscious detection, but over the course of an 8-hour workday or a long indoor weekend, it accumulates. And when you step outside, when your autonomic nervous system encounters air that moves, light that shifts, sounds that are complex and biological rather than mechanical and monotonous, something releases. The vigilance cost drops, not because you decided to relax, but because the environment gave your nervous system the signals it was built to receive. This phenomenon has a formal name in the scientific literature: attention restoration theory. Proposed by environmental psychologists Rachel and Stephen Kaplan in the 1980s, and subsequently supported by decades of empirical research, it holds that natural environments restore a specific cognitive resource, directed attention, that urban and built environments deplete. Directed attention is the kind of focus you use when you concentrate, when you read, when you analyze, when you make decisions under uncertainty. It is not infinite. It fatigues. And unlike many cognitive resources, it does not restore significantly during rest in a built environment. It restores in nature, specifically through what the Kaplans called involuntary attention, the effortless, non-fatiguing kind of engagement that natural environments automatically produce. A leaf moving in wind captures your involuntary attention. A cloud shifting shape does. Birds crossing a sight line do. These stimuli pull focus without demanding it. And that distinction, effortless versus effortful attention, is not trivial. It maps onto entirely different neural and physiological states. Effortful attention involves sustained prefrontal activation, sympathetic nervous system arousal, and the gradual depletion of cognitive fuel. Involuntary attention involves a distributed, more relaxed neural engagement pattern and is associated with parasympathetic activation, the biological state of genuine rest, recovery, and restoration. Indoor environments, even beautiful, well-designed ones, do not reliably produce this. Screens certainly do not. The problem is not that they are ugly or unpleasant. The problem is that they demand a kind of processing that nature never required. The visual field of a modern room is static. The cognitive field of a modern workplace is fragmentary and dense. And neither pattern resembles the moving, layered, gently complex sensory environment that human nervous systems were shaped inside. What I want you to sit with for a moment is the specific strangeness of this situation. You are a biological organism of extraordinary complexity, carrying a nervous system refined across millions of years to operate inside a living world. And you spend the majority of your waking hours in a container made of materials that did not exist during any of that refinement. The brain adapts. Of course it does. But adaptation is not the same as optimization. A fish can survive in a bowl. That does not mean a bowl is what fish are for. Think about this. What is your relationship with the question of why you find nature calming? If you have ever noticed this about yourself, leave a comment telling us where you feel it most, whether it is in forests, near water, in open fields, or somewhere else entirely. The answers to that question are themselves data about what your nervous system was built for. Now I want to take this somewhere most people do not expect it to go. Because the story of trees and ceilings is not just a story about stress. It is a story about cognitive architecture, about the specific way the human mind was designed to acquire information about the world, to sustain attention, to make decisions, and to recover from the cost of doing all of those things. And understanding that architecture has implications that go well beyond knowing to take a walk in the park. One of the most significant and underappreciated findings in human cognitive science over the last 20 years concerns the relationship between environmental exposure and what researchers call default mode network activity. The default mode network, a set of interconnected brain regions including the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate, and the precuneus, is active when your mind is not focused on an external task, when you daydream, when you reflect, when you imagine the future, reconstruct the past, or think about other people's mental states. It was initially dismissed as background noise, the brain idling. Subsequent research revealed it is anything but. Default mode activity is now understood to be critical to creativity, to emotional processing, to autobiographical memory consolidation, and to the kind of slow, integrative thinking that produces insight. Here is the problem. The modern environment systematically suppresses default mode activation. Every notification, every demand for directed attention, every task-switching cycle drives the brain away from default mode and into task-positive network activity. This is not inherently bad. Task-positive activity is how you get things done, but the ratio matters enormously. A brain that never enters default mode is a brain that never fully processes experience, never consolidates memory with the depth it requires, never accesses the associative, non-linear thinking that produces the most original solutions. It is a brain that is always responding and never integrating. Natural environments, particularly natural environments without human activity and without digital devices, reliably activate the default mode network. The soft, involuntary attention that nature produces creates the mental conditions in which the default mode can run. This is why people report that their best ideas come to them during walks, during time at the ocean, during moments in gardens. It is not mysticism. It is the brain finally having the space to do a category of processing that the rest of the day made impossible. What the ancestral environment provided, without anyone having to plan it, was a natural oscillation between focused attention and diffuse awareness. Periods of concentrated sensory alertness, tracking movement, monitoring for threat, executing physical tasks, alternated with long periods of what we would now call mind wandering. That wandering was not wasted time. It was maintenance. It was the cognitive equivalent of sleep, running the cleanup and consolidation functions that focused activity cannot accommodate. And the environment itself regulated the oscillation. Nature told you when to focus and when to rest. Your nervous system listened. Modern life has broken that oscillation almost completely. We are in a civilization-wide state of directed attention overload, with massively insufficient default mode recovery. And while this has produced extraordinary productivity, knowledge accumulation, and technological achievement, It has done so at a cost that we are only beginning to measure. Rates of anxiety disorders, attention deficits, decision fatigue, creative stagnation, and emotional exhaustion track closely with the degree to which people are separated from natural environments and from unstructured, digitally free time. This is not coincidence. It is the signature of a mismatch between what the brain was built for and what contemporary life provides. There is a specific feature of trees that I want to return to because it contains something more nuanced than the general point about nature and stress. It concerns canopy structure, the spatial geometry of what you see when you look up through branches. For a brain that evolved in woodland savanna environments, looking up through a canopy of leaves is associated with a very particular condition. You are in shade, which means you are protected from direct solar exposure, which means thermoregulation is easier. You are concealed from above, which means aerial threats cannot easily spot you. And you are surrounded by life, by the dense biological activity of a living ecosystem, which is one of the oldest signals of environmental richness and food availability the human nervous system knows. Researchers studying what is sometimes called the prospect refuge theory, first articulated by geographer J. Appleton and later expanded extensively, have found that humans across cultures show consistent aesthetic preferences for environments that offer a combination of open prospect, the ability to see into the distance, and refuge, protection from behind or above. This preference is not culturally constructed. It appears in the landscape choices of children who have never been told what to prefer. It emerges consistently across disparate cultures with completely different aesthetic traditions, and it maps almost exactly onto the structural features of the woodland edge environments where hominins spent much of their evolutionary history, places where you could see threats coming from a distance while remaining yourself partially sheltered. The underside of a tree canopy satisfies the refuge condition perfectly. It gives you cover from above while allowing lateral visibility. Your nervous system registers this geometry as a high safety configuration, even when there is no conscious threat assessment happening. And the fractal structure of the branches overhead does the additional work of engaging your visual system in its natural processing mode. Effortless, restorative, genuinely relaxing at the neurological level. A ceiling does not do this. A ceiling provides physical shelter, certainly, but it does not satisfy the refuge preference in the same deep way because it is not a biological structure. It does not move. It does not change with light or wind. It carries no information about the ecological richness of the environment. It is, to your ancient nervous system, an ambiguous surface in an ambiguous enclosure. Your brain adapts to it. It learns to treat it as background, but it does not respond to it the way it responds to canopy. With the specific combination of physiological relaxation, visual restoration, and autonomic downregulation that millions of years of coevolution with living structures has made automatic. This helps explain something that has puzzled urban planners and public health researchers for decades: the dose-response relationship between nature exposure and mental health outcomes is not linear. It is not the case that people who have access to parks feel slightly better than people who do not. The effect sizes in the research literature are striking. Studies in the United Kingdom, Japan, Canada, and Scandinavia consistently find significant reductions in depression, anxiety, and stress-related conditions in populations with regular access to green space. Not modest reductions, not barely detectable effects. Meaningful, clinically relevant differences that persist after controlling for confounding variables. The Japanese practice of Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing, which began as a cultural recommendation and has since been subjected to rigorous scientific scrutiny, reliably produces measurable physiological changes, including reduced salivary cortisol levels, decreased blood pressure, improved immune function through increased natural killer cell activity, and significant reductions in self-reported stress and negative affect. These outcomes are not produced by exercise. Controlled studies have found effects even when participants walk at very slow speeds through forest environments. They are not produced by fresh air and isolation. They are specific to the biological complexity, fractal visual structure, and acoustic richness of natural environments. The acoustic dimension deserves particular attention. The sounds of nature, moving water, wind in leaves, birdsong, occupy a specific frequency range and variability pattern that the human auditory system processes differently from mechanical sounds. Research using EEG has found that natural soundscapes promote parasympathetic activation and reduce amygdala reactivity. The amygdala, the brain structure most associated with threat detection and fear conditioning, responds to natural sounds as it responds to familiar, safe stimuli. Mechanical sounds, HVAC hum, traffic noise, the ambient acoustic texture of offices and homes, these occupy a different register. They do not trigger fear, but they maintain a low-grade alertness that natural sounds actively dampen. Birdsong is worth a moment of particular reflection. The specific significance of bird vocalizations to the human nervous system is something researchers are only now beginning to articulate clearly. Birds, in the ancestral environment, were information. Their presence indicated ecological health. Their alarm calls indicated approaching predators. Their silence indicated the same. The patterns of bird behavior were a real-time environmental monitoring system that hominins tracked continuously, often below full conscious awareness, the way you track the acoustic texture of a space without deliberately listening to it. Human brains became attuned to birdsong over an enormous span of time, and this attunement is not trivially overwritten. People in experimental studies respond to natural birdsong with measurable physiological calming, even when they are not consciously attending to it, even when they are performing cognitively demanding tasks. This matters because it means that the recovery effect of natural environments is not dependent on conscious appreciation or deliberate mindfulness. You do not have to notice the birds. You do not have to think about fractals. The restoration is automatic because it is not a response to meaning that you assign to nature. It is a response to signals that your nervous system has been reading since long before your species developed the cognitive capacity to reflect on them. Which brings us to the most difficult implication of all of this, the one that sits underneath all the mechanisms and the research findings and the evolutionary explanations. Modern life has not given you better things than nature. It has given you different things, things that satisfy some of the brain's needs extraordinarily well: social connection at scale, narrative complexity, intellectual stimulation, novelty, achievement, while leaving other needs in states of chronic, unaddressed deficit. The particular need for embodied contact with living biological complexity, the need for a visual environment that speaks the brain's native visual language, the need for an acoustic world whose rhythms the nervous system was built to read, the need for the slow, effortless, default mode activating restoration that only a genuinely natural environment reliably provides. The brain is not broken by modern life, but it is running with a persistent background sense of something missing, a sensory environmental deficit that no app, no screen, no indoor plant, and no beautiful piece of interior design can fully address. Because what is missing is not a category of content. It is a category of physical reality. The living, fractal, acoustically rich, biologically complex, thermally variable, spatially layered world that your nervous system grew inside for millions of years and was shaped specifically to inhabit, process, and recover within. You can spend a weekend outdoors and feel the difference in your sleep, your clarity, your emotional baseline, your ability to think through problems that seemed intractable on Friday afternoon. Not because you had a good time, because you briefly gave your nervous system the environment it was designed for. Because you let it stop monitoring an ambiguous enclosure and start doing what it does best, reading a world that is alive. If you have made it this far into this video, you are the kind of person who finds this kind of depth worth your time. And that is exactly who the Darwin Way exists for. Subscribe if you have not already, and share this with someone whose daily life is spent almost entirely indoors. They will feel this. There is one final thing worth naming. Because the temptation, when you understand all of this, is to respond with guilt. Guilt about screen time, about indoor work, about everything modern life requires of you. But guilt is not a useful frame here. The evolutionary lens is not a moral lens. Your ancient brain's preferences were shaped by a world that no longer exists, and navigating the gap between that world and this one is not a personal failure. It is the defining condition of being human in the 21st century. What the science offers is not a verdict, it is a map. A map that tells you where some of your persistent tensions come from, where some of your unexplained heaviness on certain days originates, why certain environments make you feel like yourself in ways others do not. Why, when you walk into a room full of living plants and see light coming through leaves, something in you recognizes it before you have time to name what you are recognizing. That recognition is old, older than language, older than agriculture, older than anything your culture ever taught you to want. It is the nervous system remembering what it was built for. It is the brain, for a moment, in its native world. And in that moment, even if you cannot stay, even if the ceiling is waiting, something that has been quietly tightening finally lets go.